Praise is due to Allah, whose worth cannot be described by speakers, whose bounties cannot be counted by reckoners, whose claim to obedience cannot be satisfied by those who attempt to do so, whom the height of intellectual courage cannot appreciate, the divings of understanding cannot reach, he for whose description no limit is laid down, no eulogy exists, no duration is fixed. Lord Almighty Allah sent His beloved, Holy Majesty, Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi, in fulfillment of His promise and completion of the Prophethood. Please send Durud Sharif in the court of Holy Majesty. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Shafiana Habibana Nabiyana Maulana Muhammad wa ala Ummul Mu'minin Sayyida Khadijatul Kubra Amirul Mu'minin Ali al-Murtada Hussain Sabin Rasul Fatima Zahra Imam Hassan Mujtaba wa Sayyidu Shuhada Abdullah Imam Hussain wa Sayyidina Abdullah wa Sinda Bibi Amina Sayyidina Abu Talib Sayyidina Bibi Fatima Sayyidina Muttalib wa alihi wa barik wa sallim. In respect of the biography of the Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi, we have been talking about the events that had unfolded before Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi had announced his prophethood, which we remember as Ba'isat. It is said that the Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi, whenever he went into any place, whether it was desert or it was forest, wherever he went, he would find the trees and the stones addressing him and sending salam in his court by saying, Assalamu Alaikum Ya Rasulallah. The Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who spent continuously a long time in peace meals every year in Cave Hira, wherein he would worship Lord Almighty Allah. And according to one tradition, it was 17th of Ramadan that Lord Almighty Allah sent the Wahi to Hazrat Jibreel to Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The first 5 verses of Surah Iqra. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbukal akram. Now, this was the revelation with which the Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had announced his prophethood. As I said in my previous lecture as well, that it was not the case that the Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did not know about his being a prophet or being a messenger. He knew it very well. But the order from the Lord hadn't come. So when the command came from Lord Almighty Allah to make obvious to people his prophethood, his messengership, he did it after 40 years of his life. And it is also of paramount importance that the verses that Lord Almighty Allah sent to him as the first verses were from Surah Iqra. Naturally, the question that comes to our mind, why Lord Almighty Allah chose these 5 verses? These 5 verses in reality speak about ilm, knowledge, education. They also talk about the creation of a human being by the Lord. They also talk about pen. And you ought to remember one thing, that the first verses which were revealed to Prophet of Allah had made it very clear the kind of prominence that Islam has given to knowledge, to education, to reading and writing. You all knew that the entire society of Arabia at that time was involved into all kinds of superstitious things, the kind of false things that they used to worship. It was an outcome of their superstition, of their ignorance. And that's why Lord Almighty Allah, according to certain scholars, chose Surah Iqra, which talks about knowledge, so that when the knowledge is received by people, naturally ignorance goes away and people would realize what they were doing. It was nothing but all practices that they were indulged into were false, were wrong. And once they received the truth, once they received the knowledge, naturally they would worship the Lord who had created them, Lord Almighty Allah. That's why people say you wouldn't find that Surah Ikhlas that speaks about unity of Lord Almighty Allah, or Surah Fatiha, all right, which actually praises the Lord, which is also a prayer, a supplication, and which is also the most powerful surah. Though there is a tradition which is connected with Surah Fatiha, that it was Surah Fatiha which was revealed first to Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi. But most of the people do not accept that. They say that it was Surah Iqra, and there is a unanimity amongst the scholars as to the revelation of the Surah Iqra, the first 5 verses of Surah Iqra, revealed on Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi, with which the Prophet of Allah announced his prophethood. There's another important point, whether this carried the ayah Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Some scholars say, pointing towards a tradition from Hazrat Ibn Abbas, that in reality Lord Almighty Allah first sent Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and when Hazrat Jibreel came, he asked the Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi to recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, then he started reciting Iqra. Some scholars have disagreement with that, but anyways, what is important to note here is that with this particular announcement began the work of Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi of inviting people towards the folds of Islam. With these words, I conclude my talk. Inshallah, we'll continue with this. Please send through the Sharif in the quote of Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.